home from my mother's funeral with dirt still on my shoes. That's the detail I'd always come back to when I try to explain what happened that afternoon. The dirt. I hadn't even changed out of my black dress yet. My mother had been in the ground for maybe 3 hours, and I was already standing frozen in my own hallway, hands still on the front door, listening to my brother's voice carry from the kitchen like he owned the place, which, as it turned out, was exactly what he had in mind. Let me back up a little. My name is Natalie. I'm 31 years old. I'm a middle school art teacher in Columbus, Ohio. And for the last 4 years of my mother's life, I was also her primary caregiver. My brother Marcus is 44. He lives in Phoenix with his wife Carla and their 2 kids. He visited mom maybe 4 times in 4 years, twice at Christmas, once when she had her hip replaced, and once when her doctor used the word terminal, and suddenly the geography between Ohio and Arizona didn't seem so impossible to cover. My mother's name was Ruth. She was 73 years old, sharp as a tack until the very end, and she had built a quiet, careful life on her own terms after my father left when Marcus and I were kids. She worked as a bookkeeper for 30 years. She lived in the same house in Westerville for over 2 decades. She drove a used Honda and clipped coupons and put every spare dollar into savings and real estate because she said she never wanted to feel helpless again the way she did when my father walked out. When she died, she left behind the house in Westerville, paid off, worth around $340,000 in the current market, a savings account with just over $1.1 million in it, and a small rental property in Delaware, Ohio that she'd bought 15 years ago and had been generating steady income ever since. She had a will. It was clear. She had updated it 8 months before she died after a long conversation with her attorney and after an even longer conversation with me at her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold between us. She left everything to me, not because she loved Marcus less. She told me that herself more than once. She left it to me because I was the one who had been there. I was the one who had driven her to chemo every Tuesday for 14 months. I was the one who had rearranged my whole life, taken on fewer classes, given up a relationship that probably deserved more from me, and moved into her guest room for the final 8 months so she wouldn't be alone at night. Marcus sent cards. He called on Sundays, sometimes. He sent a fruit basket when she started chemo that I remember thinking was a strange choice. Mom knew what she was doing. She had her full faculties. Her attorney had documented that explicitly, anticipating exactly the kind of challenge that was coming. She just hadn't told me that part yet. So, I came home from the funeral. I had ridden with my aunt to the cemetery, and then she dropped me off at my own house because I needed to change before the reception at my cousin's place. I was supposed to be there in an hour. I walked in, didn't even take my coat off, and heard Marcus's voice from the kitchen. He had a key because I'd given him one 6 months ago when he came to visit Mom. I hadn't asked for it back. That had been my mistake. I stood in the hallway and I heard him say clearly to someone on the phone, "She's at the reception for another 2 hours at least. I need you to tell me if it's worth challenging her mental state in those last months. There has to be something we can work with." I did not move. I don't think I breathed. There was a pause. "Then she was on a lot of medication, Carla. That's all I'm saying. And Natalie was the one managing all of it. That's not nothing." Another pause. I know. But $1.1 million and the rental property, that's not, look, I'm just saying we should at least talk to someone before we sign anything. I backed up slowly. I stepped outside. I closed the door without making a sound and I sat down on my front porch step in my funeral dress and my dirty shoes and I pulled out my phone. I did not call my aunt. I did not call my friend Jody, who I tell everything to. I opened my contacts and I scrolled to the name of my mother's attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had handed me her card at the reading of the will that morning and said, in a way that now made complete sense, "Call me if anything comes up in the next few days." I texted her. Something came up. She called me back in 4 minutes. I whispered the whole conversation, sitting on that cold concrete step, because I could hear Marcus still talking inside through the front window. Patricia told me to write down exactly what I had heard, time-stamped, as soon as possible. She told me not to confront Marcus. She told me not to let on that I knew anything. She told me she had been expecting something like this and that my mother had been expecting it too, which was why she had taken certain steps that she would explain to me in full on Monday morning. Your mother was a very thorough woman, Patricia said. I know, I said. I know she was. I sat on that step for another 10 minutes. I let myself feel it, the grief that had been sitting in my chest all day like a stone, and now this new thing on top of it, this ugly, specific hurt that is different from grief. Grief is losing someone you love. What I felt standing in that hallway was something else. It was realizing that the person I had been standing next to at the cemetery that morning, the person who had hugged me and said, "She's at peace now, Nat," had been doing math in his head the entire time. Then I stood up, brushed off my dress, and went back inside. Marcus was in the kitchen making himself a cup of coffee like it was his house. His phone was face down on the counter. He looked up when I walked in and his expression shifted for just a second, surprise maybe or something else, before he smoothed it back into something that looked like grief. "Hey," he said, "I thought you were going straight to Cousin Denise's." "I needed to change," I said. I kept my voice completely even. I am a middle school teacher. I have spent years learning to keep my voice even when I want to flip a table. "You okay?" he asked. "It's been a long day," I said, which was true in more ways than he knew. He nodded. He looked down at his coffee. "This whole will thing," he started. I turned and walked to my bedroom. "I can't talk about logistics today, Marcus," I said over my shoulder. "My mother is in the ground. Give me a few days." He didn't push it. I changed my clothes. We drove separately to the reception. I smiled and accepted condolences and ate a plate of food I don't remember tasting, and that night I went home and sat at my kitchen table and wrote down every word I had heard him say, with a timestamp, just like Patricia had told me to. The next 3 weeks were some of the strangest of my life. Marcus stayed in Columbus for almost 10 days, which he had never done before in his life. He and Carla got a hotel downtown. They came by the house twice, always together, always warm and careful, and talking around the edges of what they actually wanted. Carla brought muffins the second time. I accepted them and offered nothing back and kept every conversation surface level and short. Carla, I want to say, I had never fully trusted. She's not a bad person, I think. She's just a person who has never in her life left money on the table. She grew up with very little and she married Marcus partly, I believe, because she saw in him a path to more, not in a calculating way, just in the way that people are shaped by scarcity. I understood it even as I watched her sitting in my living room smiling at me, thinking about my mother's savings account. During those 10 days, two things happened that I only found out about later. The first was that Marcus contacted a probate attorney in Columbus to ask about contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence. The argument would have been that I, as the caregiver managing my mother's medications and appointments and finances, had exerted pressure on her to change the will in my favor. This is apparently not an uncommon argument, and it can sometimes work, especially when the deceased was elderly and in poor health, and the challenger can paint the caregiver as opportunistic. What Marcus did not know was that Patricia had prepared for this exact argument. Mom had known it was a possibility. She had watched it happen to a friend of hers years ago, a woman whose daughter had contested a will on almost identical grounds. And so 8 months before she died, when she updated her will, she had also done 3 other things. She had a full cognitive evaluation done by her neurologist and had the results documented in her medical file. She had a video recorded, with Patricia present as a witness of herself reading her own will aloud and explaining, in her own words, why she was leaving her estate to me. And she had written a letter, addressed to Marcus by name, that was sealed and held by Patricia's office. I didn't know about the video or the letter until Patricia showed them to me that Monday morning. I sat in that office and watched my mother on a laptop screen, sitting up straight, her hair done, the way she always insisted on presenting herself even in her last months, looking directly into the camera and saying Marcus's name and explaining with complete clarity and zero anger exactly what she had decided and why. I don't think I can fully describe what it felt like to watch that video. It was like hearing from her one more time. Like she had known she wouldn't be there for this part and had made sure to show up anyway. The second thing that happened during those 10 days was that Marcus's probate attorney apparently told him that the case was not strong. My mother's cognitive evaluation, which Patricia had already shared with them as a preemptive move, was thorough and recent and completely clean. The video was devastating to any undue influence argument, and the letter, which Patricia read aloud to me because Marcus had already received his copy, was even more direct. My mother had anticipated every argument. She named each one, addressed it plainly, and ended the letter with something that has stayed with me every day since. She wrote, "I have lived my whole life making myself smaller so that other people would be more comfortable. I did not do that with this. I chose Natalie because Natalie chose me every day for 4 years when she didn't have to. That is not manipulation. That is love. I hope you will eventually understand the difference." Marcus withdrew from the probate challenge on a Thursday, 11 days after the funeral. Patricia called me on a Friday to let me know. But it wasn't over. Not quite. About 3 weeks later, I got a call from my property management company about the Delaware rental. A tenant had reported that someone had come to the property claiming to be the new owner and had asked to be let inside to assess the condition. The tenant, thankfully, had refused and called the management company instead. The description they gave me matched Marcus's wife, Carla, almost exactly. I called Patricia again. I also called Marcus directly this time for the first time since the funeral. He picked up on the third ring. I didn't raise my voice. I told him I knew about the rental property visit. I told him I had the tenant's account in writing. I told him I had documented every conversation, every visit, every text he had sent me in the past 3 weeks asking about timeline and transition. And I told him that if anything like that happened again, if anyone contacted my tenants, my bank, my attorney, my neighbors, or anyone connected to my property or my mother's estate, I would pursue it legally, fully, and without hesitation. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I just thought it should have been equal, Natalie." And I said, "You weren't there, Marcus. Equal isn't the same as fair." I hung up. I haven't spoken to him since. That was 7 months ago. He sent a text at Thanksgiving, a group text to me and a few cousins, something generic about being grateful, and I read it and set my phone down and went back to the sweet potatoes I was making. My aunt knows the outline of what happened, and she hasn't pushed me to reconcile. A few other relatives have opinions, I'm sure, but no one has said anything to my face, and even if they did, I think I've gotten comfortable enough with the truth that it wouldn't shake me the way it might have before. Here's what I want to say to anyone watching this who has been in a version of this situation, whether it was an inheritance or a house or something that wasn't even about money at all, just about who showed up and who didn't. And then who showed up at the end when there was something to gain? The grief and the betrayal do not cancel each other out. You can love the person you lost with your whole heart, and also be gutted by what the people left behind chose to do with their first hours and days of loss. Those two things live next to each other, and neither one makes the other less real. Give yourself permission to feel both without deciding one of them is wrong. My mother spent her whole life trying to make sure I would never be helpless the way she was. She planned for me even when she was dying. She sat in front of a camera and she said my name and she made sure her voice would be in the room after she was gone. I think about that video a lot. I think about her, hair done, sitting up straight, looking into the camera. She always showed up for me. I tried every day to do the same for her. That's the whole story, really. That's all it ever was. I still have the dirt on those shoes. I haven't cleaned them. I keep them in the back of my closet and I don't know exactly why, but I think it's because they were the last thing that touched the same ground as her. And some days that's enough. I keep coming back to the moment I was standing outside my own front door, hand not even off the knob yet, listening to my brother plan his next move while my mother was still fresh in the ground. That image doesn't leave me, and I spent a lot of time since then trying to understand what it taught me, not about Marcus, but about myself, and about what it actually means to live a life you can stand behind. The thing about doing the right thing is that it almost never announces itself as the right thing while you're doing it. When I was driving my mother to chemo every Tuesday, I wasn't thinking about the will. I wasn't keeping score. I was just showing up because she needed someone to show up, and I was the one who could. That's it. There was no strategy in it. And I think that matters because when Marcus made his move, he was operating from a completely different place. He was calculating. He saw an outcome he wanted and he worked backward from it. And that calculation is exactly what undid him because my mother had seen it coming long before either of us did. She was the smartest person I've ever known. Not in a showy way. She was a bookkeeper from Westerville who drove a used Honda and clipped coupons. But she understood people. She understood cause and effect. She knew that what you do quietly over years is what actually defines you, not what you say at a funeral, not what you text afterward, not the fruit basket you send when things get serious. She had prepared for my brother's challenge not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. She saw the situation honestly and she planned accordingly. That kind of clear-eyed thinking, the willingness to face a hard truth and act on it with precision instead of hope. Watching her do that from the other side of it changed something in me permanently. And then there was the part I had to do myself. Sitting on that cold concrete step, deciding not to panic, deciding not to confront him in the kitchen, deciding to make one quiet phone call instead, that took something I didn't know I had until I needed it. Because every instinct I had was telling me to walk back in there and say something. The steadiness it took to not do that, to stay patient, to trust the process, to let the truth do its own work on its own timeline. That was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than 14 months of chemo Tuesdays, harder than moving into the guest room, harder even than the funeral itself. What I know now is that those three things, doing right by the people who need you, thinking clearly when everything in you wants to react, and holding on when the holding on feels impossible, those aren't separate qualities. They build on each other. You can't sustain the hard work without the clarity to understand why it matters. You can't stay steady under pressure without the foundation of knowing you've acted honestly. They're one thing, really. My mother had all three in spades. I'm still working on mine. I think about her sitting in front of that camera, hair done, back straight, saying my name. She showed up for me one last time in a way I never expected. The least I can do is try to be that kind of person for someone else, someday when it counts.